Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation, Helping Others Through Challenging Times, presented by Elissa and Eric Ruckle. My name is Maureen Johnson, the CARES Act Recovery Program Marketing Coordinator, and I'll be facilitating today, working behind the scenes to help you have a great learning experience. You're welcome to use the chat box function at any time during the session to ask questions of us or your presenters. I'll hand it over to Jill Klein, the Wyoming SBDC State Director, for an intro of our presenters.
Okay, well, thank you, Maureen, and welcome back to those of you who were with us last week, and welcome to any newcomers. And because there are a few newcomers, I will give just a brief overview of the Wyoming SBDC network, just to make sure everyone is aware of our services. So the Wyoming SBDC is hosted by the University of Wyoming, and our services are available to all residents in the state, and we're funded by the U.S. Small Business Administration federally, and then from the state through the Wyoming Business Council. What we do is provide no-cost confidential advising and technical assistance to any of Wyoming's entrepreneurs. Our advising staff is strategically located throughout the entire state so that we can ensure services are provided statewide and by someone who's familiar with the communities they serve. And our services range from helping a business determine if their idea for a business is viable to actually getting started, to existing businesses who might want to grow or reinvent their business, businesses that are ready to develop or execute a succession or exit plan, as well as businesses recovering from the various challenges they frequently face. And that brings us to why we're here today. We are challenged by the impacts and experiences of the COVID-19 pandemic. And because of the pandemic, Wyoming SBDC was able to get additional funding from the Small Business Administration to carry out a CARES Act recovery program. This program has allowed us to really contract with a number of supplemental advisors who bring additional expertise in various topics and industries. So today's webinar is being offered through the CARES Act funding, and we're so happy to have Eric and Elissa from Elevate Wyoming back to present today again on helping others through challenging times. As you may remember from last week, if you were here, Elevate Wyoming really loves working with companies that believe work should be a worthwhile, enjoyable part of our lives. We spend so much time at work, right? So businesses obviously want to be successful, and part of that success means having a vibrant, thriving workforce and culture. So Elissa and Eric promised to help build and sustain an environment that has a business's entire team excited to come to work every day. So with that, Elissa, I'm going to turn it over to you and let's get started.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Both Jill and Maureen, thank you so much. And SBDC, you guys are just awesome, taking care of the people that take care of people. So we're proud to be a partner with you and get to have fun during our lunch days on Wednesdays. So it's good to see some familiar names and faces back from last week. It's always a good sign as a presenter when folks come back the next week. That is good news. So appreciate you guys taking time out of your lunch hour to come spend another hour with us. I don't know if we have. I'm just going to ask because I don't know. Do we have any folks who weren't with us last week that are joining us new this week? If you would just take a quick minute. I don't know if Eric, you can unmute yourself, and then you can tell us who you are and where you're from, like what region of Wyoming, what city, and what agency you actually serve. If we have new folks, we'd like to know who you are. Nobody.
Hey, I'm Jennifer Power. I work with Laramie Main Street Alliance, and I am new this week.
Oh, very cool. Thank you, Jennifer. All right, so I'm going to assume that everybody else was with us last week. And what we'll do after this session, our third session will be next week. And we'll focus on that session, on that peer-to-peer kind of engagement and learning from each other, how we can better serve those in our community. So that'll be an additional time to really get to know each other and some of the challenges you might be facing and the things that you found to be successful, so we can start to build that network across our great state, and not only helping ourselves, but helping others. So you'll remember, those of you that were with us last week, our focus was on, things that we can do to take better care of ourselves. As we talked about last week, if we end up overwhelmed and stressed out and, just a frazzled mess, we're not of much service to others. So in order to contribute our best work and help those that we're here to serve, we have to take care of ourselves first. So one of the things we asked you to do at the end of the session last week was to think about some of the things we talked about, whether it was that conscious leadership above the line, below the line, lizard brain kind of activity, or, decision making, deciding whether it's fatal or not fatal, really, just how bad is this going to be. Gave you some tips in terms of how to manage stress and worry more effectively. So one of the things we tossed out was to take some of those ideas and put them to work, maybe just give it a go, see how it worked, if it helped you, maybe help the stressful situation, or, managed your stress a little bit more effectively. So if you would just take a minute in the chat, and if you have a story that you'd like to share, it could be a success, kind of a win. Here's what I did and it worked really well in this situation. It's an opportunity for us to learn from you. Or it might be one of those things that here was a situation, here's what I did and it didn't go well. So here's what I'm going to adjust for next time. So what I kind of learned in that situation. Either of those, just stories of things that you put into practice maybe this last week and would like to share as an opportunity for the rest of us to learn from you. If you have a story, if you would, drop it in the chat, and then we'll call on you to share your experience with the rest of us. And Eric's going to be watching the chat for me.
And to clarify, you don't need to type the entire story into the chat. If you just in the chat say, I have a quick story, then what we'll do is we'll unmute you and pull you in so you can share the story. Looks like Robin has one.
Nice. All right, Robin.
Okay. I don't have anything real specific, but I tend to, when we're in stressful situations here at the bank, usually it has to do with employees, and I tend to try to immediately solve the issue, and I don't think things through enough. So I've tried to step back, think about the issue just a little bit before I open my mouth, and whether I'm upset by the situation or whatever, I tend to calm myself down a little bit by the time I react to it. So that helps a lot.
Very cool. Well, kudos to you, one, for giving it a go and for noticing it's actually kind of making a difference. I know for a lot of us that are wired, we kind of have that fixer wiring. Anytime there's a problem, a solution, it's quick jump in, here's what needs to happen. Here's how we need to fix it, and might be creating maybe more damage than good. So it's often good to just take a breath. Thank you, ma'am. Do we have anybody else who would like to share an experience with us?
I'm not seeing anyone else at the moment, Elissa, so I think we're good to roll.
All right. Well, thanks, Robin, for stepping in and helping others. Yeah, kind of learn from your experience. That's one of the things we want to facilitate in these discussions. Kind of save some time on our end too, if we can hear from other folks and their stories and their situations. Then when we find ourselves in a similar situation, we can say, oh yeah, I remember, Robin said this might work. And then we just have more additional tools for our tool belt. So today we're going to shift gears a little bit, taking from the first step, right? How do we help ourselves manage those stressful situations more effectively so that we can bring our best selves and actually help others? Now shifting to others and helping them through those challenging times. As you probably have experienced, oftentimes when other people's stress, somebody else, either that you work with is in the office or a customer, a business that maybe you serve, when they're stressed out, when they're overwhelmed, when they're freaking out and losing their minds, it tends to have an impact on us and the environment we're in. So how do we help them through those challenging times? Move them maybe from an overwhelmed, stressful situation to a more productive use of our time and energy. So not only, to help them in the truest sense of the words, but also the environment and the rest of those folks that might be impacted by that. So whether it's at work or at home, some ideas today for how you can help others through some of those challenging times. We're actually going to start our discussion with this word that gets thrown around a lot, empathy, and kind of what that means. So one of the things, people look for, especially in terms of leadership, it doesn't matter what level you're at, but how we demonstrate empathy and how effective we are at helping individuals through those challenging times and situations. So a lot of it stems from how effectively we are to demonstrate empathy. So my first question to you is, what does that word mean to you? So when you hear the word empathy, what other words come to mind? We'll just populate the chat. So whatever words pop in your mind when you hear empathy, go ahead and drop that in the chat and Eric will read them off for us.
Ashley mentioned the idea of compassion. Jill threw out the concept of active listening. Compassion also came up from Christina. Good point, Paul. Understanding someone else's perspective, which is another one of those words that gets thrown around a lot, perspective.
So one of the things that's interesting, especially from the answers that came out of the chat, it's one of those words that when you ask people, what does it mean to be empathetic? We'll have different ideas of what that looks like, which will dovetail really well into the conversation we're going to have here in just a minute. There are actually different types of empathy. While we tend to think of there's just one, and this is what it looks like to be empathetic. Maybe it's that, compassionate, active listening sort of empathy. Just being able to put yourself in the other person's shoes, right? Understanding the situation they're coming from or feeling what they're feeling. Tends to be one view of what empathy is, when in actuality, there's three that we're going to talk about. So we can have a little adaptability in terms of the situation and the person, and in terms of how we might respond in that situation and what empathy looks like in that situation. Actually comes in a lot of different forms. So one of the things to think about as we're moving through these, ideas of empathy and what that looks like is, how that's going to come into play when we're helping someone else. As you can imagine, it's very difficult to meet someone where they are and help them through a situation if we can't relate to them in any given way. So empathy, typically, I would say, maybe is the first step in being able to effectively help others. If we don't have that ability to at least have them on our radar, we're not going to be very effective in helping them. So one of the first things I would say is, to have that awareness of what's going on around us, which is why probably what we talked about last week is so critical. If we are so internally focused on in terms of our stress, our overwhelming whatever's going on, other people aren't going to be on our radar. So it's going to be more effective for us and for them if we've taken care of our own, right? We're in a pretty good headspace and mental space so that others are on our radar. So we can pick up on some of those cues that, wow, this person is struggling or, dealing with some challenges, seems to be a little overwhelmed and stressed out right now. So what can I do to help them through that situation? So once they've entered our radar, then we can look at this, the different types of empathy. What's interesting, I think, when I've spent some time diving into this, they now refer to situational empathy. So it's not just the one thing that we think it is. It very much depends on the situation, and it very much depends on the person and how we might most effectively help them. So 3 types we're going to talk about in terms of the situational empathy. The first being cognitive empathy. And that really is just coming from a very logical perspective. So being able to understand logically the situation they're in and understand their perspective. I think, Paul, that was the comment that you threw out. So I can logically process where they are and how they are responding in that situation. It probably won't surprise any of you, and I'm sure you've had that experience where sometimes, you know, somebody will be in a situation or responding to a situation and your brain actually says, I don't understand. I don't understand why this is so difficult. I don't understand, you know, why they can't wrap their brain around this. It doesn't make sense in my head. That's because we're trying to approach it from a cognitive perspective, and logically, it may just not make sense to how our brain is processing things. So that, of course, option might not be the best in that situation. Another type of situational empathy we'll look at is this emotional empathy, or this idea of emotional empathy. This isn't just the superficial kind of, yeah, I get. I can process the fact that you're frustrated or that you're angry, because identifying the emotion that they may be feeling is more of a cognitive, right? I can logically process the emotion that they're feeling, where emotional empathy truly is, I feel what they feel, quite literally. So I have a really good friend of mine who truly is, I would put in that empathy category. She feels on a very deep level the feelings of others. So we can be at a restaurant, and you know, if our server is having a really bad day, I'll be dipped if she doesn't feel that and just craters. Has a tremendous impact on her emotion and her emotional state, just because she feels it so deeply. The third, we're going to go ahead. I think we jumped ahead too. Awesome. So part of that emotional empathy, it's also known as that personal distress. We feel what they feel, and it causes us emotional and physical distress, or this, you know, it's an emotional contagion. So we feel it's very contagious for those people and very difficult for those folks. Interesting, kind of funny story that it's just to demonstrate this point. I know when Eric and I lived in California, they had just opened the Holocaust Museum. And so we went to LA to be one of the first through this museum. And as Eric and I were walking through, we had, quite a group of folks with us. We got to this portion of the museum where there were, just huge pictures of incidents when newborns were being thrown out hospital windows. And as I'm looking at these images and the stories, I fell into that emotional empathy and felt what that felt like, and was so completely overwhelmed with emotion physically. It just overwhelmed me, and I had to leave the museum. It doesn't happen very often that I find myself in that state, but sometimes it is just overwhelming when we feel what they feel. Sometimes, as you can imagine, it's going to be more appropriate than others, depending on the person and the situation. The third that we're going to talk about is this idea of compassionate empathy. And I know that word compassion came up in the chat a couple of times, tends to be what we think of in terms of empathy. So compassionate empathy is kind of that middle ground, that balance where we can understand, we feel their pain because we've been there, we've been in a similar situation. It's something that resonates with us, or that we can relate to pretty easily, and at the same time we can process and logic through, either through our own database of experience, or being able to just what needs to happen to move out of this, what's the first action step. So having that compassionate empathy, we can see a situation and then identify, here's what I can do to help, or here's what we can do to move into a more productive state, and then we actually move to take action and do something about it. So those are the three we're going to talk a little bit about. Truly a logical response, then the emotional response, then kind of finding that middle ground. How can I help you, and actually do something to help you move forward? So as we take a look at some of those, I mean, as you're thinking about those situations, one of the things I'm going to ask you to do is just take a minute to think about in your world, in your day-to-day activities and the people that you serve, whether it's internal, you know, with other coworkers, colleagues, or external with the businesses that you serve, the customers that you serve. What might be some situations where cognitive empathy is going to be the most useful? So logically being able to process where they are. And maybe what are some situations where that emotional empathy, truly feeling what they feel, what do those situations look like? And then finally, what might be some situations where that compassionate empathy is going to be the most useful? Think about it for just a minute. And then when you have a suggestion, a situation, you can just throw it in the chat and maybe just put a cognitive hyphen, here's the situation, emotional hyphen, here's the situation. As we start to populate the chat, then not only will we have a better idea of those situations, right? But then we can be on the lookout for and it'll be easier for us to identify, here's the situation. So maybe this type of, situational empathy would be more effective. So take a minute, think about it, and then we'll populate the chat with your ideas. What are those different situations and what do they look like?
And because silence is such a strange thing, especially being silent for even as short as a minute, I've got a little clock running. You're already almost 20 seconds through the most painful part of the webinar. So congratulations.
I'm still trying to figure out why my part's the most painful part.
Technically, I was referring to the silence, not your part of the webinar. 15 seconds left, folks, to think about different situations.
Yeah, you can just start throwing ideas in there. One thing I would say, situation, when there is, we have an 18-year-old daughter, and sometimes she will be in a situation that is just, she's frustrated, she's already overwhelmed, she is stuck in this emotional pit. And in that situation, as Robin kind of mentioned earlier, fix-it brain will step in, and I hit her with logic. I come from a very cognitive empathy perspective. And so I start hitting her with logic, and you need to do this, you need to do this. Have you thought about this? Which, because of where she is not the right approach, not the most effective, because it just ends fuel to her overwhelming state of mind. So for me, in that situation, when I'm dealing with someone who is already very emotional and in the throes of that emotion, it is best for me to take more of an emotional empathy approach in that situation, maybe not feeling what they feel, but at least be able to ask the questions that are more emotion based. So connect with them on more of an emotional level rather than just a logical level. Might be a situation where emotional is more effective. Other ideas coming in the chat. Eric, have you seen any other ones?
Yeah, one that Paul mentioned was the idea of having a job performance issue and being in a situation where you have to address that. It makes me think that as people who are supporting or providing help to other people in the community, it could happen one of two ways. You might be in a situation like Robin mentioned, where you have a certain amount of authority or influence over the person that is having the performance issue, or because so many people in this group are resources to other people, you might actually be counseling someone who is in that position. So they're facing performance issues from their team or their employees or someone on their team. So you're trying to help them deal with that situation a little bit better. That one response brought both of those to mind. And then Ashley mentioned the idea of the difference between empathy we might need to demonstrate in a professional situation versus in a personal situation. Robin brought up the idea of taking a cognitive approach to it when you see someone experiencing a challenge, being able to step back and kind of process and think about what is it that is happening. And then Christina brought up, I think, two different aspects of that idea of flexibility or situational empathy that you mentioned. One is the idea of who we are also, Like I may tend to gravitate to one type of empathy versus you might tend to gravitate to a different one. That would add to, I think, the idea that you said different people want different forms of empathy as well. So those were the things that got thrown into the chat.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for not only managing the chat, but for those that threw in suggestions. So that would be the thing I think I would throw out to you guys to think about, are the different types of empathy, and maybe not just a one size fits all kind of approach. When we tend to think of empathy in the more traditional sense, this is what it means to be empathetic. But having more gray, I guess, to play in. So maybe it is a more cognitive approach or a more emotional or more compassionate, depending on the situation, depending on the person. And I think as maybe Christina and Robin said, and depending on us and where we tend to be. So that's actually the last kind of key bit we're going to focus on in terms of situational empathy, is finding that balance, not only for ourselves, but also those that we are working to help through those challenging situations. So on the next slide, you'll see a graphic that kind of maps out what that balance looks like. So in terms of, on the far end of one slide, we'll have the very cognitive, strictly logical. And for me, I know I tend to fall in that's my default. That's where I come from in any given situation. The challenges, as you might guess, in those situations, when we're dealing with somebody who may be in an emotional state, or somebody who, maybe compassionate approach would be more effective. When we approach those situations from a very logical perspective, it might create a false perception of being insensitive, or that we don't care, or that, we really don't understand. I know, especially with our kids growing up, it was the joke in the house that, if there's anything, a wound, a, hurt, we need comfort, we need nurture, we go to dad, because mom is the logical one, is just going to tell us to rub some dirt on it. So you might create that perception of being insensitive or not caring. So being mindful of that, right? That strictly logical approach, and how, what that perception might be. On the other side of things, if we tend to come from a very, emotional side, it can be very overwhelming. And that, of course, is going to prevent us from being help to anyone. If we are overwhelmed by the feelings, that we are feeling for them, we're not going to be able to help them through that situation, because it does become debilitating. So finding that middle ground. So if we find ourselves on a very, if we tend to be very cognitive in our approach, then things we can do to demonstrate, I guess, more emotion or connecting with them is to ask some of those questions. So how are you feeling? You seem to feel, or you seem to be very frustrated, or very, overwhelmed right now. And, does that seem accurate? And, and how do you feel? And what tends to be going on in your brain right now? So asking some of those more feel questions will help them identify where they are. And then we can start to ask some of those, so what might be a good first step? And, what might you be comfortable doing to help move them toward that middle ground? And it also helps us kind of meet them in the middle. On the other hand, if we're, coming from a very emotional response ourselves, then the things we can do is ask some of those more logic triggering questions, like what's one thing maybe I need to do? What's one thing I need to look at? What's a piece of information that I need to have? If we're helping somebody else through that situation, and maybe they're in a very emotional state, it's asking them those kinds of, logical questions. So what's one thing, that might make this better? What are some things that you've considered? What are some, possible solutions that we might explore to help engage their brain? Because if it's them or us, if we find ourselves overwhelmed with emotion, especially if it's our lizard brain that has been triggered and we're in that fight or flight kind of mentality, then it's asking those questions that are going to trigger our brain to actually activate and get engaged, so we can move out of that toward a more solution oriented. So on both sides, whether it's us recognizing for yourself, you tend to be more cognitive, so how do we connect with them more emotionally? And if you do tend to come from a more emotional position, then what are some things, some questions you can ask of yourselves or them to move toward that more, logical, compassionate based. So whether it's us or them or the situation, one of the things we want to work toward is using all of these tools to mitigate maybe the impact of either side and influence ourselves and them to more that middle ground, that compassionate empathy. So understanding their perspective, understanding what they might be feeling, and then working toward a solution. Here's what I can do to help. Here's maybe something I can contribute, whether it's my time, my resources, my whatever. Here are the tools I can give them to help them through the situation, or actually come together, work together with them to put together a plan to help them move forward. So finding that balance for ourselves and others. One of the tools that might be able to help us is, first thing we might have to do, especially when we're talking about those very emotional situations, is diffusing the situation. So it tends to be a little less emotionally charged and more logically charged, so we can move forward. So I'm going to hand it off to Eric, who's going to talk to us about how we might diffuse those situations better.
The linkage that came to mind as you were walking through that, Elissa, is the word diffuse. If you've ever found yourself in a conversation with someone who's operating on a more fight or flight, lizard brain type of mentality, it can be a really volatile situation because they're going through a lot in that moment. So by de-escalating some of those emotions, what we're doing is, in a way, we're kind of pulling them into the middle of that spectrum that Elissa mentioned just a few minutes ago. So one way that you can get people to start to process through some of this information is by asking them what's the worst thing that can happen. And this also does link back to the idea of fatal versus non-fatal, because one thing that was mentioned in the session last time is your lizard brain is not really very intelligent. It operates at a very basic level. And it's either this is going to kill me or this is going to kill me. Like, that's the only time the lizard brain kicks in. And so the idea of getting people to actually almost have a conversation to calm the lizard brain down. Like, what's the worst thing that could happen in this? Okay, I could get fired. All right, let's say you got fired, right? What would be the worst thing that would happen out of that? Which sounds like a really horrible conversation to have. But the idea behind it is, by getting them to lean into it, by talking about the things that they're afraid of, oddly enough, it actually calms people down, because they then start to imagine, well, if I did get fired, I would have to go out and apply for new jobs. Okay, let's say you went out and you had to apply for new jobs. What's the worst thing that could happen with that? Well, I might never find a job. You might never find a job. What happens if you never find a job? As crazy as that conversation is, as you lean into it, what will happen is people almost start to realize, oh, well, I would find another job, right? I could still pay my mortgage. I would find another way to get through this. And by having that dialogue or that exchange, what's the worst thing that could happen? Very rarely are they actually dealing with situations like, I'm not going to be able to feed my family anymore. But the lizard brain, again, can't distinguish between this could be an unpleasant conversation or I'm not going to be able to feed my family and we're all going to die, because the lizard brain automatically runs to that extreme. So then the idea of, well, how likely is that really to happen? Now you're starting to bring them back from the ledge just a little bit. This thing that they were so afraid of, you're kind of pulling them back into the realm of reason just a little bit. And this conversation happens with either people who are very logical in nature, because they tend to talk like they're logical, but the lizard brain is still back there. So don't let them fool you. Even though they're talking like they're a rational person, if they're afraid of something, the lizard brain is just talking in like logical terms. It's using math, but it doesn't make it a mathematician. So the idea behind it is, how do you get them to kind of walk through some of those ideas, talk through some of those ideas? How likely is that to happen? It is also a way that you can approach it with some flexibility, because for someone who tends to operate from a very cognitive or logical perspective, this is a logical question. Like, let's just kind of look at it. Like, what would you put the odds of that happening at? It's 50-50 that would happen. Is it really 50-50? Or are you just kind of worried about it? Like, what do you really think the odds are that this person is going to blow up and get angry and the meeting's going to go horribly? Okay, maybe it's only about 20%. All right, so 20%, what needs to happen so that we avoid that 20%? Like, what do we need to do? That kind of conversation could be handled from a very logical perspective. If you or the other person tend to be more emotional in nature, or you tend to feel a bit more than you think through situations, like how likely is it to happen? Okay, if it were to happen, how would you cope with it? Like, how are you going to deal with that? How would you react? What would you do? Robin mentioned earlier the idea, maybe it's something simple like take a couple of breaths. Like whatever it is they say in the meeting, let's have this agreement before you walk into the meeting. You're going to count to 3 and take a deep breath before you say or do anything. Like that for an emotional person might give them the comfort level and the confidence level that, okay, now I can deal with this situation. So again, you're trying to bring that person who's very logical into the middle of the spectrum, that person who's very emotional, you're trying to bring them into the middle of the spectrum. These questions work for either one. It is a little ridiculous. We all recognize that, to have a conversation where you're leaning into what they're afraid of. So it's kind of counterintuitive, but it might be worth, again, just experimenting between this week and next week. When you hear someone starting to freak out about something, just throw out in some way, what do you think is the worst thing that could happen? It's interesting to see just the way people respond to that question. So it's one way you could experiment with using these ideas. On the next slide, we talk about the idea of, again, diffusing. So when we look at a situation, this does tend to be a more logical type of questioning. So an advantage if you are an emotional person, or if you're dealing with someone who tends to operate emotionally, is you're starting to pull them into the middle of that spectrum. So what is the problem we're trying to solve here? And there's a fairly famous quote, if you do any searching for problem solving. Einstein has a quote that I'm not going to say as well as Einstein did, but I'm no Einstein. The idea behind it was, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I would spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes solving the problem. And so the idea that what is the problem we're really trying to solve here? And it's also known as root cause analysis in some circles. So when you're talking to someone who's dealing with a situation, one way you can pull them off the ledge is by trying to really define what the problem is. And if you're more emotionally attuned, then it might be an emotional problem that you're trying to solve. If you're more logically tuned, then you might approach it that way. Either way works. Give you an example. A friend of mine who owns a business, one of his employees recently accepted a job offer with another company. And so there were two aspects of what he was dealing with. There was a very emotional aspect and there was a very logical aspect. And so what I found myself in the conversation doing, partially along these lines, was asking him questions like, what is it that's bothering you about this? Because I could just hear the tone in his voice. Like, what upsets you about this? And he was talking about logical features. So I was able to call those out and say, okay, it sounds like these things are bothering to you from a business perspective, but it sounds like there's something else going on. Like just in your tone of voice, I hear something else. What is it that's really bugging you about this? And then he could talk about what the emotional stuff was. So you might ask the question a variety of different ways, but what you're trying to uncover is what's the problem we're really trying to deal with here? And even if you don't go any further into any of the other little tips or pointers that we cover next, just by helping someone define the problem, that might be the most valuable thing that you give to them, because that is the 55 minutes versus the 5. Moving into the next question you see on your screen, the idea of who would need to be involved in that solution. Maybe it's just the person you're talking to. Do you have the ability to solve this on your own? Or who else would need to be in the conversation? The third question that you see is a concept that I think gets a bad rap. And Elissa and I joke about this just on a personal level. I've led much of my life according to the philosophy of the minimum viable product. Like, what is the lowest amount that I can do and get through this situation? Whereas Elissa is the person who always blew the grading curve for everyone in class. She had to have 100% on everything. And so the idea behind the minimum viable solution, or the minimum viable next step, is what's the minimum we need to do to take the next step? And by minimum, the reason I say it gets a bad rap is that if what you're doing is, there's also an old phrase that says like good enough for government work. And the implication I've always taken from that is shoddy workmanship. And so that doesn't mean your minimum viable product is bad. What it means is, what do we need to do in order to take the next step? Like whatever that line is, what is the problem we're trying to solve? Who needs to be involved in solving it? And what's the minimum thing we want to accomplish in that conversation? Just by talking through that, what you're doing is you're lowering their expectation where they feel like they need to solve the whole problem. They need to boil the entire ocean in this conversation. What's the minimum thing we need to do? Well, if we could all get together and agree on the problem, that would be great. Okay, well, that sounds like a good next step. How do we get that in motion is one way of saying the last piece in terms of what's a first step. Do we send an email? Do we send a text? Do we talk to someone? Like, what's the next step? What's the first step that needs to happen in order to make this move? So what you've done by that point is you've kind of walked them through an idea of what is the problem we're after, and you've gotten to a point of what's the first step we need to take to make that happen. If you've done that, what you've really helped them do is you've counseled them through something they're dealing with that's probably pretty emotional in nature, and you've actually gotten them on a pathway. So on the next slide, what you'll see is a slightly different approach. The idea behind this is the aspect of not just diffusing a situation, but actually helping people. And so there are some philosophical pieces to this. One is that I think we all like to live in an orderly world where we feel like we have control. And there is also the mindset or the perspective that when things are going wrong, we have an opportunity. Like if everything is orderly, it takes a lot to create change. On the other hand, if there's a lot of change going on, there's a lot of dirt and smoke and noise, and there's a lot of things happening, there is an opportunity to make things occur that you couldn't otherwise have caused. As one example, I'll throw out to you guys the idea of working from home, taking part in virtual meetings. If we had not had the pandemic, think about how long it would have taken Wyoming to adjust to the idea of virtual work, virtual meetings, virtual interactions. I think we would have gotten there, but it would have taken us a very, very long time. And it also creates opportunities for businesses and providers and resources. So that idea of having that mindset and maybe just planting that idea every once in a while into a conversation where you're talking to someone who's struggling with the idea of control, like maybe, well, here's another thing that I've heard, or I came across this the other day, and you're not trying to convince them of it, but you're just planting the seed. You're putting the idea out there. If you happen to be a fan of the movie Inception, it's like you're opening the safe and you're putting the spinning token in it, and then you walk away. Like let them come up with the idea on their own. The other thing to plant that you might consider that would help people through this is, I think folks, especially people who are supporting others, they feel like they're supposed to have the answer. And it's helpful sometimes to just reference no one has the answers in this situation. And for us to expect that you would know how to handle this is unrealistic. You've never lived through this before. They've never lived through this before. So let's let go of the idea of perfect. And let's not let it get in the way of what's a first step that we might be able to take. What really matters out of this is that we're doing something. And I have a good friend who he used to drive this at home in meetings because we'd talk about all these things that we could do. And his contribution towards the end of the meeting was usually, well, I think we should do something. Because if we're choosing between doing nothing and doing something, I'm a fan of doing something. So what is that something? What are we going to do? And kind of tying all these ideas together, the last idea that you see on this visual is maybe we can try things now that we wouldn't try in other times. Like maybe the normal solution isn't the solution to try. Maybe this is a time to try something different. And if you're trying something different, it also helps to say, let's try it and see what happens. Like, I don't know if it's going to work. I don't know if it's going to solve the problem, but hey, this idea you have for a first step, why don't we just take that first step and see what happens? A few other ideas for you on the next slide. When you think about the idea of helping people, a good friend that I made early on in my career was kind of the person everyone went to get things done. And her name is Susie. And Susie makes her sound like she's a really comfortable, caring, loving person, which she absolutely was. But she also was a fantastic manager of problems because so many came to her, so many people came to her, she had to get good at navigating all this stuff. So one question I learned from her is when someone would come to her with a problem, she would actually ask the person straight to their face, are you just here to vent or do you want me to help in some way? And it was remarkable being near her, how many people would say to her, no, I really just want to complain for a couple of minutes. Okay. And sometimes she would literally look at her watch and she would say, I've got 2 minutes, go. And they would sit and complain for 2 minutes and then they were done and they would walk out of her office. It was fantastic. And other times they would say, I think I actually could use some help on this. But just by asking the question, it caused them to shift their mindset. So they didn't know the answer to that question until she asked them. And a second question that she was really good at asking them somewhere along in the conversation is, how hot is this burning and how high are the flames? And how close is it to your house? Like, how urgent is this problem? And she asked it in a way that worked in her personality. You can ask it in whatever way it works for you. But again, just by asking that question, it's funny to see people go through putting it in a category. Well, this is actually, it's not as urgent as I thought it was. If I had something by next week, that would be fine. But when they walked through your door or they picked up the phone and they called you, the lizard brain was screaming, you have to solve this now or we're all going to die. So the next piece on here ties to that idea of timeline. When are you hoping this will happen? When are you hoping that you would have this in place? And there is a very intentional piece of strategy behind the word hoping. If we ask the question, when do you want this or when do you need this? We're letting them establish a timeline. And that then gives them control over us. And that's not what we're trying to do in this situation. That would be a different conversation. But if you say, when are you hoping this will happen? And they give you a timeline, now you get to take the last step you see on this slide, which is now you can gauge it against your schedule and your priorities. I think we've all probably seen the thing that somebody printed up and put in their office that said, an emergency on your part does not constitute an emergency on my part. But yet often we know it feels like that is the case. So by asking, when are you hoping to have this? And then following up with a little bit of a reality comment, would it help you if I could have it for you by Wednesday? I know you said you want it today. I've got a bunch of other stuff in my schedule, but I think I could get it to you by Wednesday. Also going back to the idea of having integrity with our word from the first session, like this gives you a chance to say, what can I realistically commit to and feel really good about being able to hit that target. So a variety of ways that, again, you could very tactically handle these situations in terms of what Elissa was talking about, hopefully that work both for the people who are more logically wired, as well as the folks who are a little bit more emotionally wired. Elissa, I think I'm handing it back off to you.
Yes, you are. So a couple of suggestions. I hope you guys are following the chat too, from Sally and from Hope. So appreciate, the thoughts, contributions too, additional things for us to chew on. Oftentimes that root analysis, yes, can help prevent future problems. Otherwise, we don't really know what the problem is. So we come up with a solution, but it's not actually fixing the problem. And we keep running into the same thing over and over again. And getting the other person come up with a solution, the idea, as I think both Eric kind of mentioned, and then Hope from your point, gets them to think about, right? Is this really the size and magnitude I thought it was? And maybe I just needed to vent and throw up. If they don't have a solution, then yeah, maybe it's not as significant as maybe they were making it out to be. So good ideas as far as how we engage them in that process, so we're not carrying the lift. The last thing, excuse me, we're going to leave you with is this idea of demonstrating emotional intelligence. I know that comes up a lot. It's kind of the buzzword in the industry right now. So in terms of helping others through challenging situations, whether, we're a service provider, we're helping, as a chamber, we're helping our members keep their lights on and actually, keep folks coming in, revenue generating, or we're, with an economic development agency or a Main Street agency, helping those individuals through this stress and pandemic, or it could be an employee. Oftentimes, the label that gets put on is, how effective we are at, successfully helping others, our level of emotional intelligence. And that perspective is based on how we handle those situations and how we navigate others through those situations. That becomes the litmus for, our level of emotional intelligence. So some of the things, just to kind of break that down a little bit for you, maybe help us understand the components and what we can do to demonstrate emotional intelligence and create the perception that we do have, high EI, which stems back to that empathy and being able to respond effectively in that situation. So 5 main elements that have been identified in recent years, kind of can either be a one and done or a progression through, depending on how you read these 5 elements. Starts with self-awareness and then kind of moves through that self-regulation, motivation, empathy. So we'll talk about that just briefly, and then social skills. So emotional intelligence really is kind of the ability to demonstrate all 5 of those in any given situation with any given, individual, and to help navigate them through that challenging situation. So we'll quickly look at each one of those a little bit and then give you some things to chew on between next week or this week and next week. So on the next slide, you'll see in terms of self-awareness, it goes back to many of the things we talked about in the very first session, right? Understanding where I am. Am I above the line or below the line? Is my lizard brain engaged? What is my response to this situation? I see a person who's in a challenging situation, they're in a crisis. Is my internal response one of inconvenience? Like, really, I don't have time for this right now. Is that the brain space I'm coming from? So that's the first step is understanding where we are and how our, cognitive approach or emotional approach, our, defensive lizard brain, our whatever response in that situation, what impact is that going to have on them and the situation they're in? So really being self-aware. And the second piece is that self-regulation, which kind of goes back to what Robin was saying earlier. I'm going to stop and take a moment to think before my mouth engages. But it also is that idea of, the biases and filters that I know how I'm processing that information and being able to recognize that and regulate that. So in that situation that they're in, I might not feel the same way. I might not process it the same way. So I'm going to regulate my response, kind of close it off to the side so I can better understand where they're coming from. But I need to regulate my response, my reaction, the way I do things more effectively first before I can understand where they're coming from. The third then on that item, when we think of motivation, we tend to think of, that drive, that taking the initiative. There's an additional component that maybe we don't think about, and that's, being able to stick through the obstacle and not just throw in the towel. So having that internal strength to keep going. So especially when we're helping others, they might be causing us frustration or stress or, whatever the impact might be having on us, being able to recognize that and not just give up and say, you know what, I don't have time for this. This is beyond my scope. But being able to stick with them through that, even when it is difficult, and viewing maybe some of those obstacles, like Eric talked about earlier, as an opportunity, right? So rather than an obstacle or a barrier, here's an opportunity for maybe me to try something differently or to help them try something differently. So sticking with it. It's kind of that idea of, grit, sticking with it until you've seen it through to the end. Then the idea of empathy, right? Not only being able to understand where they are and meeting them where they are, but understanding our approach. And maybe it's cognitive, maybe it's emotional, maybe it's more of that middle ground, compassionate, but understanding where they are, where we are, and then how we can influence more balance to move things forward. Last component of that in terms of emotional intelligence is kind of goes back full circle to where we started this, having those social skills. So having the ability to pick up on other people's, comments, behaviors, nonverbals, having other people on our radar, and then being able to relate to them as a person and meeting them where they are in that situation. So it kind of comes full circle. So hopefully, some of the takeaways, in order to better kind of, taking from what we talked about last week, in order to better serve others and help them through those challenging situations, it starts with us. Whether it's knowing how we respond to situations from an empathy point of view, or in terms of emotional intelligence, that self-awareness and self-regulation. How do I bring my best self to help them? And the next step in that then is, not only having them on our radar, but meeting them where they are. and understanding they're coming from an emotional response, or maybe a more intelligent response, and we need to help them connect with some of the feels for the rest of the team, or that those that they're interacting with. So shifting the focus from us to them and helping them through those situations. So between now and next week, well, first, very glad you guys were here to join us for another week, and take some of these ideas and chew on them, and maybe look for opportunities to help others. And then you'll have some, opportunities next week to get into some pretty good conversations with others in terms of what you've tried and what worked, and maybe what didn't work, so we can continue to learn from each other. If you have other questions, thoughts, feel free to reach out to all of the fabulous folks at SBDC, some of the resources that they have available. Great first point of contact. And if you have any questions about what we've talked about today, or what we have on tap for next week, or even things that have percolated since last week, you can drop me or Eric a note at Elevate Wyoming. We are here to help, and happy to help if we can. So thanks for joining us today. I don't know, Maureen, if you have additional thoughts before we sign off.
Yep, just checking in to say thank you guys again for a great presentation. I'll be following up with everyone with a quick link to a survey just about your experience with the webinar. This really helps us put together great content for you, your business, your community. So please fill that out when you see that email. I'll also include a registration link to next week's webinar with Elissa and Eric. That'll be more discussion-based, peer-to-peer discussion about these topics. So keep an eye out for a little bit of communication from me, and then I'll also send another follow-up email with a recording link to this presentation so you can share it with your colleagues and get it out there into the world. But other than that, just want to say thank you guys. And we'll see you all next week. Thanks, everybody.